Skagway, Alaska, home to the greatest little railroad in the world, the WP and YR. The White Pass and Yukon Route. Constructed in 1898 to carry the saints, sinners, and scoundrels to the Klondike goldfields, it's fast approaching its centenary. The year 2000 will mark exactly 100 years since the last spike was driven home. Closed for a brief period between 1982 and 1988, it now operates a summer excursion service, carrying an ever-growing number of summer visitors. Today, in the company of engineer John Westfall, we ride aboard a White Pass Alco 101 class. Ahead of us, a rare view of the route to the 3,000-foot summit. 20 miles of blue-green glaciers, tumbling waterfalls, and sheer spectacle. A view of Alaska that never fails to please.
These are the 101 class engines, and they start fairly abruptly. So what I do is just leave the brakes on entirely on the engine and put it in the first notch. And then as it starts to load up, the amperage starts to load up, I'll release the brakes gently until we start to crawl ahead.
Carrying an average of 1,500 passengers a day, safety is top priority.
We used to have just a regular 10-minute spacing between trains and only 2 spots that you reported by, but we had radios that you could only reach the dispatcher in 2 spots. Now we have radios that we can reach everybody just about anywhere now. We talk to the dispatcher constantly. He monitors all the trains. The reason we have to talk to him is because we're on a verbal block system, which approximately every 2 miles there's a reporting point. We call them stations, and I have to report when I pass by them. And if there's a train behind me, he cannot leave the station till I leave the station ahead of him. It keeps us separated to prevent rear-end collisions, basically.
On this occasion, we have one train ahead of us and one behind. The one in front is also a passenger train pulled by the older 90-class diesels. The one behind is a work train, also hauled by 90-class locomotives. On this video journey, we're joined by one-time White Pass conductor Steve Heitz.
The White Pass is one of the last operating narrow-gauge railroads in North America. It is certainly the very last railroad which carried freight, and because of that, you might say it was the last of an entire breed, an era. And it is doing more or less today what it did back in 1898 as a passenger railroad. It's still hauling people from Tidewater at Skagway, Alaska, up over the Coast Mountain Range to the headwaters of the Yukon River, where they could continue on up into the interior.
And those are oldies broad-top hopper cars from Pennsylvania. We no longer use. We bought them for haul ballast. Those are flat cars left over from the freight haul, now just used in work train service, hauling ties and rail. And this is the coach yard, which is rebuilt just about a year ago. On a busy day, every single car that we have is in service. And they range from brand new to over 100 years old.
In the White Pass shops, a rigorous maintenance program sees earlier cars refurbished from stem to stern. This one dates back to the last century. When the ceiling was removed, this old poster came to light. An imaginative time capsule put in place by a craftsman with a sense of humor. It was left in place when the new ceiling went back. Who knows when it'll again see the light of day.
Now we're coming up on the shops, and storage tracks, and the fueling facilities. The car shop is close to us, and here's the rotary snowplow, which was on display at Bennett for many years until just a few years ago we went up and brought it back down.
In an age when everything old is new again, number one is back in the shops, being restored. The rotaries were replaced by more practical products of the 20th century, some 30 years ago. The cat, or to be more precise, two cats working as a team. The spectacular sight of the rotaries burrowing and blasting their way through the snows, once a distant memory, is soon to be revived.
Well, I hired out in '74 and the plows hadn't been used for about 10 years. We had two plows still around at the time. There was one down on the beach that was later shipped out, and the one that we just passed. Approaching the crossing to the graveyard. We have two longs, a short and a long, which is a standard warning for a crossing, and a warning for other things as well, bridges, tunnels. There's a road out to the graveyard, gets a lot of traffic. This is the graveyard curve, and we'll be entering a new track. It's about 3 years old now. Probably the longest tangent on the American side of the border now. And it's our fast track. It's rated for 30 miles an hour, which is our top speed. A little sag, and then we straighten out and head up a slight grade. And we crank the engines right up to the 8th notch, which is as far as they go. They did get us away from a mountainside where we had rock problems every now and then.
In the late 1960s, the White Pass moved into high gear. One of the world's largest lead-zinc mines opened in the Yukon Territory. The 101 locomotives were purchased. Bridges were built. Tunnels were blasted. A mammoth amount of work was undertaken. Finally, the Anvil Haul was underway. 70 years young, the WP and YR that had played such a vital role in the development of the North took on a new look.
They're 1,200 horsepower compared to the 90s, which are mostly 900 horse.
Number 31 has 61 plus 4.
They were built, we call them Alcos, but they were built in Montreal by Montreal Locomotive Works, which was a Canadian affiliate of Alco. Alco and Montreal are both out of business now. But Bombardier bought the patterns and the patents.
Unfortunately, I came on the scene almost at the very end of the railroad. I started working in '73 for the White Pass, and it was still a freight line. I mean, we were running heavy freight. You know, you'd be running 60, even 80 car freight trains in the middle of the night. The night freights, and then of course the day trains. The head-end brakeman used to ride in the cab of the locomotives, depending upon which train set you were riding on or the time of year. Sometimes you'd even ride up on the very head end, and get a chance, of course, then to get the engineer's point of view as well.
Here we're starting up the first little grade. It's just a little hump, 4-mile hill. This is a little sag, and we're getting towards the end of our 30-mile-an-hour track. For sags, you want to keep the train stretched if you're going to start back uphill again. In fact, that's all that running a train really is. You don't have to steer it, obviously, but you're controlling the slack in the train and the speed, and trying to do so in a way that doesn't knock people down. So if we were stretched coming up the hill, if we keep them stretched by setting some air on the train and keep pulling with the engines, and they'll stay stretched. And when we get to the bottom of the sag and start up again, which is happening right about here, then you can release the air and the train will stay stretched. And that was the end of our fast track. We're approaching 5 Mile, which we call Boulder, and it's a reporting point. Little meadow here, we often see little bears, fireweed. And this is the first real grade on the railroad. We're up to probably around 3% here, heading up the river valley. In about a mile, we'll cross over the East Fork of the Skagway River, 5A Bridge, which is also known as Denver.
The White Pass story contains all the elements of pure drama. In July 1897, out of the blue, news of the Klondike Gold Strike hit the headlines. The event propelled the world into improbable and exciting activity.
Close Brothers Financial House of London had determined to build a railway from Skagway to the gold fields. They had actually been working on the project for quite some time when the news of the Klondike excitement hit the newspapers around the world. Sir Thomas Tancred was sent north with several American engineers to determine whether or not the route was actually a feasible one. Tancred arrived in March 1898 with his engineering partners into Skagway, Alaska. They went up the White Pass Trail by horse. They saw the carnage left behind by the winter on the Dead Horse Trail, and Tancred was appalled at the country. Upon returning back down the trail to the St. James Hotel, he had determined and told his engineering partners that he was going to write a letter to London informing them that the project was impossible.
There the matter sat until late that evening, when Canadian Michael J. Heaney stumbled into their hotel, disheveled and dog-tired.
Heaney joined the group, and they inquired as to his business, and he informed them that he had just returned from days on the trail making an independent survey for a railway over White Pass. Heaney had been involved in building railways in the Canadian Rockies. He'd worked with Stevens, building the Canadian Pacific, surveying it through the Rocky Mountains. And they called him the boy contractor. But that night, as he explained what he saw in the mountains, Tancred listened very closely, as did his American associates. And they came right out and said, look here, Heaney, we represent British financial interests that are interested in building a railway through the pass. It seems that fate has brought you to this table tonight. Do you believe that you can build this line? And he said that there was absolutely no question. It would be hard, it would be a close thing. But, and the old line coming out of the different versions of it was, you give me the money, I'll give you the railroad.
Number 31 is up over.
I don't get bored with the trip. Every day is a little different, and especially in the morning like this, it's just pretty on a sunny day. The first run in the morning is usually the nicest thing. The way the sun hits on things. Most of the time, once you're on a grade with a train and a train like this, you're wide open, pulling as hard as you can. You don't need to worry about exceeding the speed limit. We were probably doing in the neighborhood of 15 or 16 miles an hour here. The speed limit is 20. And there really isn't much to do once you have it wide open, assuming that the engines keep working properly. You just sit there and hope they keep working properly. And they just pull as hard as they can. Pretty soon the grade will lessen quite a bit. We'll be whistling for 5A bridge. It's at Denver, which is the head of the Denver Glacier Trail. We fairly often drop people off there to hike. There is 5A bridge, and in front of us is a rock quarry that we just opened up this year. On a summer day, a hot sunny day, you notice a big difference in the water in the river. Between the morning and the afternoon, it comes up quite a bit with the snow melt. Now we're at 6 Mile, and this is the start of a pretty steep climb of about a little over a mile. This is a spot where you find out how your train is really going to pull, because it's as steep as just about any spot on the railroad. You just keep pulling. With a train like this and these engines, we were probably down to about 14 or 15, which is, you have to go about 15, maybe 16 up the hill to make your schedule. Running passenger trains like this, we still use a train order system and a timetable, which is fairly rare anymore. It means that you can't leave a station before your authorized time to leave it. That isn't on account of passengers or anything, it's account of other trains are using those times to protect against your movement.
This is the 90 class train running ahead of us. Destination, Fraser, British Columbia. Its route takes it beyond the summit into Canada, then on to mile 28. Of the original 110, 40 are presently in service. The Gold Rush Stampeders' marshalling point, Lake Bennett, mile 40.6, is the present limit of operations.
This is Rocky Point. The valley opens up below you in two directions. You can see back to the Denver and 5A bridge, and off in the other direction is the town of Skagway. It's the best view of town, probably, from the railroad.
Deceptive as it runs through the sunlit foliage, this section posed the toughest tests. Rocky Point yielded slowly to Mike's black powder.
Rocky Point could have stopped the railroad project, but they actually found a way to get through it, maximizing the grade and removing the minimal amount of rock. It was a nasty piece of business. Even in 1898, you know, the major factor controlling a railroad's success was the ruling grade. In between the milepost 6 and milepost 7, the ruling grade had to be kept down to where trains would be able to have enough tonnage to make it worth your while. You can't run a 2-car train up a 7 or 8% grade. You have to be able to have enough tonnage. And the ruling grade at that particular point to get to Rocky Point, had they not been able to get through that particular point, it was going to be a tunnel. Tunnel construction in narrow gauge terms, this far up in Alaska on a budget that had already been blown all to hell, that was going to be a hell of a business.
Number 31 has left.
And this is a Rocky Point cut. Sharp curve here, and it was always a nasty spot with a long train. I was a fireman for a fellow one day, and right at this point I was back in the last unit. We had 5 101 engines. I was back in the last unit reading some gauges and watched as we came around that curve, and the engine slipped a little bit and the train just jumped off the track. We had empty ore containers on the front, and they just bounced right off, and you know, they leaped off. Springs went flying everywhere, and of course we screeched to a stop. That was pretty much the end of that particular trip. It took a long time to clean up the mess. Those flags are wired to the bents of the bridge, and if the rocks come down that chute and knock the bridge bents out, the flags will trip, is the theory. Now, approaching that bridge, you have to make sure the flags are up. If the flags are down, you stop and inspect the bridge. The bridge was knocked out about the summer of 81 or 82 last time. I've seen the flags down a couple times myself and stopped, but the last time it was because the wires holding the flags up had rusted through and the flag had fallen by its own weight. 7B bridge is at the bottom of the little sag, and then we start back up the grade here. And around this curve is 7C bridge. Bridges are numbered according to the milepost between a mile. Well, anything past 7 mile is a 7-mile bridge, and then A, B, and C, and D, and so forth in order. So this is 7C bridge, the third bridge after 7 mile. And it was knocked out by a rock slide about 1980, somewhere in there. It's a steel bridge, and it was quite a repair. We're at Clifton. Clifton at one time had a section crew station there. There was a section house, and people actually lived there year-round.
Clifton just happened. It was like so much of the White Pass. It's almost as if the good Lord, as they were laying track, decided he'd make some scenic opportunities right along the right-of-way, which would give the railroad flavor and character unlike anything anywhere else in the world. Again, building the railroad, the key was to have the least amount of rock removal, and thus, as the survey parties ran the lines, and then the engineers following right behind, they plotted out the track to follow as much as possible the natural lines of the valley. Clifton was a pleasant surprise in terms of photographers for the next 100 years, because with the rock outcropping like that over the North Switch, I mean, it creates an interesting photograph. But it just happened.
Well, we slow way down for Pitchfork Falls. It goes by so fast.
The telephone lines were put in by the U.S. Army right after the war as part of the communications system into the north. And we're not just for the railroad. In fact, you can tell by looking along the side of the railroad track where the old phone lines used to be, the ones that are in the photographs from the early days. At one time, all of the telephone communications into the Yukon came up through that particular line. Today, of course, they're unused, and in fact, the entire line has fallen into disrepair. But when I first came on the railroad, we used to use that the dispatch circuit and the admin circuit to talk to Carcross or to Bennett in the morning. And you'd click on in the wee hours at 7 o'clock, the dispatcher in Skagway would click on, and it's, each station up the hill, White Pass, Bennett, Carcross. And then the dispatcher would say, 7 o'clock in the morning, Skagway, Alaska, the office of the chief dispatcher.
We've been replacing rail in the last few years with 115-pound rail, which is heavy stuff. Rail is measured or weighed according to the weight per yard, so it's 115 pounds per yard. Standard rail length is 39 feet, which sounds odd, but it was designed to fit in 40-foot cars years ago. So if you still buy 39-foot rail, you can replace a section with a section. There's a lot of 40-pound rail that was used, and I understand 56-pound rail on the hill. There were some heavier engines that we had, I say we, but it was well before my time, that heavier steam engines that rarely went past White Pass just because they were too heavy for the rail. They were used in helper service, getting trains up to the top of the... Yeah, we're coming up on Heaney here, which is about 12.3 mile. It was an old station that during construction days, there was a a steep cable-operated tram line down to the bottom of the canyon here. Heaney was named after Michael Heaney, of course, one of the major contractors on the railroad. At the bottom of the canyon here was White Pass City, a tent city and a freight transfer point. White Pass had warehouses down at the bottom. White Pass City was where the road turned into a trail. And you could haul wagons from Skagway to White Pass City, and it was packed with mules from there on over.
I used to look at riding the White Pass as being a daily adventure. You never knew what was going to happen. The railroad was well maintained. It was had good equipment. The men that ran it were good men. But there was always going to be that unexpected adventure. The basic dealing of the elements when you've got a set of steel rails that have to run at a certain grade that go through a mountain range. It'd be a lot easier if the White Pass and Yukon ran across Nebraska. They wouldn't have nearly as much work to do on the track as they usually have to do. But the scenery going across through Hereford, Nebraska is probably not nearly as spectacular as the view one gets from 15 Mile on the White Pass and Yukon Route.
Number 21 has left White Pass, runner.
That rusty thing there is the famous pipeline, not the Trans-Alaska pipeline, but a pipeline that the Army put in during World War II. That's the U.S. Army, which leased the railroad for the duration of the war. We're about 13 Mile now. This is the south end of the glacier siding that we're approaching right now.
Glacier Station was a very important section house. There was a two-story section house there that housed a full section with 6, 7, 8 section men, section foreman, the cook, sometimes a cook's helper, depending upon whether or not they were in the summertime, maybe bring on an extra gang or something like that. But year-round, there was always a cook there for the 3 meals a day. Of course, in the early days, the section used hand cars, and they would actually go out on the grade with these pump cars or push cars. But they actually lived at Glacier Station. There were 2 water tanks at Glacier Station. There was a tank on the north side of the bridge, north side of 14A, and then another tank on the south side, so you could actually water the lead helper, or the lead engine, and then a helper engine cut back into the train at the same time, thus saving time in terms of your running time, filling the tanks, the tenders. This is the start of a steep grade right here.
Once you get around the bridge, at Glacier, you crank it wide open and sit back and watch your speedometer slowly drop. On a hot afternoon, it's the place where you start to get hot engines in the 90 class. And when an engine gets hot, it doesn't stop, but it drops its amperage and you get no use out of it. And it idles until it cools down, and then it comes back online. It's a problem, hot engines with the 90 class. We've replaced radiators here lately, and that seems to help. You get the bad slack action when an engine drops its load. The trains run in, even when you're on a steep grade, and then when they kick back in, you get a surge which transmits all the way back through the length of the train.
In recent times, a survey was commissioned to reassess the grade, to lessen the rate of climb. Armed with the latest tools and techniques, surveyors picked their way along the pass. After weeks of painstaking care and with computer printouts at hand, the results of their labors were announced. Heaney's work could not be improved upon. His survey crews had done the best that anyone could do. A belated tribute to the man and his railway was made in 1994. The American and Canadian Societies of Civil Engineering proclaimed the White Pass an international civil engineering landmark. Now in the company of world-renowned structures such as the Eiffel Tower and the Panama Canal, the WP&YR has been formally accorded the recognition it surely deserved.
Up the track a little ways here is it's a rock slide zone. It's also a snow slide in the spring, but the main feature of it is there's rocks come bounding down from way up on the hill. And we've had several episodes in this one spot, 15.3 mile, and in an effort to solve the problem, they've carved away the mountainside there, which is just a slide talus slope, and create sort of a shelf in a ditch for the rocks to land in.
There was a freight train going up past Inspiration Point in 1918. And there were 3 locomotives, one on the point, helper cut in the middle of the train, one on the rear. And slide came down, rock slide. It was like a slab slide of large chunks of rock. Hit the center locomotive and took it and a freight car on either side out of the middle of the train and took it right down the side of the canyon. Of course, there were steam engine days. The fireman and the engineer were in the cab. And it took it down quite a ways down the side of the hill. And it took them a number of days to find the crew.
Now we're approaching the 15-mile bridges. There's 15A, B, and C. They have a 12-mile-an-hour speed limit on them. Usually 15C, the timber trestle, has a 10-mile-an-hour slow order on it. The whole climb is from sea level to just under 3,000 feet. This is slippery rock we're going over now.
That tunnel was going to make or break whether or not this railroad succeeded. The requirements at the time of year they were putting it in, at the place that they were having to put it in, made it incredibly unique. In the meantime, all of it had to be hoisted up the side of a cliff from White Pass City. Until you got the rail up that far, you had to literally manhandle this stuff up the side of a mountain. I mean, White Pass City is 1,000 feet down below at the bottom of the canyon. And then once you got your equipment in place up there on the side of the cliff, blasting in from both sides, you could only work those men outside in the wind, just about an hour before they were so exhausted they were useless.
This is the work train. The Rockslide earth-moving equipment will be taken back to Skagway on these special flat cars.
The tunnels presented a problem in the winter in that the water runs year-round and it freezes in the tunnels. Off on our left is Mine Mountain, named because there was a mine fairly near the top of it. This was Inspiration Point Mine. It was unsuccessful. There was a cable line that ran from that mine over to the railroad tracks right at Inspiration Point. There's a little bit of machinery left. And at the mine itself, there's the terminal for the cable line. The cable is long gone. Probably down at the bottom of the canyon.
And it was riding on the head end with those old hogs on the White Pass that you began to get the flavor and the color of the country. I did some booming around, worked on the Burlington and worked on the Colorado and Southern, a few other lines. And there wasn't the story, the fabric. The Klondike Gold Rush spawned the White Pass enterprise. And from the cab, to be able to look down and see pieces of corduroy road that had been built by men the winter of 1897 to try to carry the commerce to White Pass City, to build hotels in Dawson, or carry pianos on their way down to Circle City. I mean, it was out the window.
A heavy train for us was around 2,000 tons, which is peanuts as far as large railroads are concerned. But we would be down to a crawl coming out of Bennett, which is not quite as steep as this hill, but we are always loaded with the ore. We are often loaded with freight heading this way, as opposed to ore, but they weren't as heavy trains as the ore trains. But it wasn't uncommon to be down to 5 or 6 miles an hour, which made for a long trip. During the summertime, we sent the freights out at night. There were usually 2 freights left Skagway between 7 and 9 o'clock, somewhere in there, and they would have 5 or 6 engines apiece. 40 or 50 cars. Those trains would meet with a southbound freight train at Bennett. And the 2 northbound trains would be combined into one long train, and would use about 2 engines from there on into Whitehorse. And the southbound train would be cut up into 2 trains and crawl out of Bennett with 5 or 6 engines on each half of that train.
If being engineer looks easy, John has a humbling story from his early years, one that literally swept a woman off her feet.
The instance that embarrassed me the most. I had a fairly long train. I was the engineer, and we pulled into Bennett down the long hill. The passenger cars were on the rear of the train. We would pull the train by until the passenger cars were at the eating house and then stop. And I had trouble with my dynamic brakes coming down the hill and was using air. As we got to the level at Bennett, I released the air, which was a dumb thing to do. I could have just kept pulling and pulled to a stop. But then within about a train length, I had to stop anyway, so when I set the air, it didn't work on all the cars. It felt fine on the engines. I pulled to a stop and jumped off and walked back to the eating house, and as I approached, everybody was eyeing me strangely, I thought. And the Canadian crew was there, and one of the guys off that crew finally said, "That was the worst stop I've ever seen." I said, oh, it felt okay on the engines. And I walked into the eating house, and there was a lady laying there on sort of a couch, and I said, "What's wrong with her?" And they said, "She fell over when you stopped." And I said, "Well, she shouldn't have been standing up." And they said, "She wasn't." That's the old Dead Horse Gulch viaduct. One time the highest cantilever bridge in the world. It's about 215 feet above the canyon floor there.
The steel bridge replaced a switchback, which was the most limiting single piece of railroad line location on the original construction in '98.
I've walked over it a few times, which was a little spooky, even though you know you can't fall between the ties. They're spaced too close together. You can certainly see through them, and a little bit of a breeze out there. It was spooky enough for me.
That's the image of the White Pass, this incredible passenger train going across this spindly steel viaduct headed through a break in the mountains. It's the symbol of the White Pass and Yukon Railroad, because that bridge gave the railroad, when it was finished, the ability to carry the tonnage and the volume to build the North.
It was in service until 1969. And it was bypassed by a new bridge in this tunnel.
The steel bridge simply was not designed to take the tonnage of those heavy 101 class locomotives and all of the heavily laden ore cars.
Well, we're about 19 miles on the railroad, and right below us is the famous Trail of 98, the pack trail that went from White Pass City up over the top of the pass. It's real visible here and quite close to the tracks. It's also known as the Dead Horse Trail, and there's an occasional horse skull there. The story is 3,000 pack animals died packing over that trail. I personally find it hard to believe.
I suppose the thing that I personally like about the White Pass is the fact that it's been operating all the way back to the gold rush. This is a direct link with the Klondike Stampede of 1898. that it's historic, that the line parallels the original Trail of 98, the old Dead Horse Trail down in the canyon, and that ghost towns like White Pass City and the summit at White Pass, the places where the gold rush occurred, are right beside the railway tracks. The right-of-way itself was blasted out of the side of the cliff during the Klondike Gold Rush. This is an actual operating link back 89, 90 years, and because of that, you've got something here that's very, very special. There are very few companies that can claim heritage all the way back to the stampede to the Klondike.
And we're in Canada now. The old guys talked about runs from Skagway to Whitehorse taking 6 hours. Sometimes when I hired out, it was generally about a 10 or 12 hour trip. But it was scheduled for about 8 hours. And that is Summit Lake, which is actually quite long. It's 5 or 6 miles long. This is all brand new rail. And that is as far as the summit excursions go. I don't get bored with the trip. Every day is a little different, and especially in the morning like this is, it's just pretty.
Rocky Point could have stopped the railroad project, but they actually found a way to get through it.
Once you have it wide open, assuming that the engines keep working properly, you just sit there and hope they keep working properly.
And the old line coming out of the different versions of it was, you give me the money, I'll give you the railroad.